Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Casey Anderson, chair of the Park and the Planning Commission. Dom will appreciate the fact that I give those equal billing, and that's particularly important tonight because we have Florence Williams with us, who has done a lot of thinking and writing about nature, its value, and we struggle sometimes, honestly, with grappling with some of the design issues as it relates to our development process, the way that we regulate land use to encourage provision of green spaces and provide exposure and access to nature in the more urbanized parts of our county, and also on the park side of our agency in thinking about what our priorities are for acquisition of land and what to do with it in our park system. So we're very excited about hearing from you so we can get some insight into both sides of our work. When I come to these kind of things, I always just want to hear what the speaker has to say, so I won't bore everybody with a long recitation of your very impressive biography, but suffice it to say you've had you've worked with and have been published in many very prestigious publications, including Outside Magazine, one of my favorites, the New York Times. I understand you've been affiliated with High Country News. I'm from Colorado, so I appreciate that very much. And with that, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks for coming.
Should I
swap it?
Thank you so much, Casey. And thanks also to Ellen at Brookside Gardens and to Margaret, the planning the county, for helping organize this and for inviting me. I actually live in the district, but my dad lives in Silver Spring, and he's here tonight. So I have loyalty to the county. So yeah, I wrote this book called The Nature Fix, and I'm a journalist with an environmental and English background. I don't have a science background, but I like writing about science, and I like interpreting it for a lay audience. And a lot of my writing gets inspired by my own personal story. So my personal story is that I spent 2 decades living in the Rocky Mountains. I lived in Colorado for about 10 years, and I lived in Montana for about 10 years. And I was very nature connected, almost on an hourly basis. I had trails and mountains right outside my door. I had beautiful views from my windows, which I've learned from my research actually does provide benefits psychologically and emotionally. And then I moved to the heart of Washington, D.C. about 4.5 years ago. So I went from having a backyard that looked like this to having one that looked like this. And I live fairly close to the C&O Canal, but the access to the canal is a problem. I need to tell the planners in D.C. I had to scramble kind of across a freeway and down a bridge embankment, over a chain link fence, lots of graffiti. And then, of course, once I get there, I'm under the flight path to DCA. So a lot of noise pollution. I never knew I was sensitive to noise pollution until I lived in a loud place, when I learned it. And I noticed that this new urban life I found myself in really did reflect itself in my sort of a psychological and emotional state. I was kind of stressed out. I wasn't sleeping so well. I felt more anxious. I was depressed. I did feel disconnected from my mountain kind of community and my mountain trails. And I started to wonder if what I was feeling was partly because of that. I had heard the expression nature deficit disorder, which is an idea promoted by the journalist Richard Louv, which states that when we're disconnected from nature, we do feel it psychologically and physically. And he actually spent a lot of time writing about kids and some of the diseases, chronic diseases and conditions we see in children who, as many of us probably know, are now the most disconnected generation of humans we have ever had, probably in the history of the species. So I wanted to investigate the science behind it. Of course, we're all very familiar with these old chestnuts about nature, certainly the poets and the philosophers and the romantics. Even the ancient Persians would talk about the restorative benefits of a garden in ancient Persia. Thoreau, of course, talked about going to the woods so he could really think and live deliberately. But what's happened in the last 10, 15 years is that psychologists and neuroscientists are also starting to wonder if there's a there and how they can study it. So this quote is actually from some neuroscientists and psychologists at the University of Michigan. Imagine a therapy that has no known side effects, was readily available, and could improve your cognitive functioning at zero cost. Such therapy has been known to philosophers, writers, and lay people alike, interacting with nature. So the idea that nature could actually be a medical intervention is something that is just starting to crop up, at least in North America. I was fortunate to get a couple of assignments to go around the world, actually, and see what other scientists are finding out who are ahead of the scientists here in the United States. And one of the ways I do journalism is by sometimes participating in some of the science. And so here you see me testing my cortisol levels in a forest in Japan. I'm also with the finger monitor testing my heart rate variability, which can be a measure of the sympathetic nervous system or a stress response. And I'm also wearing a portable EEG unit that measures brain waves. So now we have these tools that are really pretty new so that we can take some of this work outside the lab, wear it in the field, and actually see what's going on in our brains and our bodies. One of the first places I went was Japan. And this was for Outside Magazine. We'd heard about this practice called forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku. So I wrote about this in 2012, and it's kind of taken off as an idea. Since I wrote about it in Outside, there are now actually people who will take you forest bathing in California, and I think here there's someone doing it. But what interested me was that researchers were studying it. So they were taking groups of subjects into the woods for just 15 or 20 minutes and having people sit or stroll in the forest. Forest bathing, by the way, does not really involve taking off your clothes. The idea is that you open up all of your senses. So forest rangers, who are actually called therapy rangers in Japan, can sort of help facilitate this process to help you focus your mind on what you're hearing, what you're seeing. They'll make you some bark tea so you can feel like you're tasting some of the forest. And after just 15 or 20 minutes of this, the scientists are measuring this changes in people's physiologies, in their nervous system responses, especially. So a drop in blood pressure, a drop in heart rate, a drop in cortisol, even seeing a boost in natural killer T immune cells, which are important for fighting cancer. They're seeing effects in blood sugar and glucose levels, and in blood pressure. But one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of these studies is they're very small scale. They're almost, anecdotal. It's like groups of 16, groups of 20. But now there have been so many studies that there have been over 600 subjects studied. And at first I was skeptical of this too, because I thought, well, maybe this is just an exercise effect. These are people walking in the woods. We know that walking is good for your emotional state. It's good for your health. But the researchers really tried to adjust for that by having very similar groups of subjects walking in a downtown area in a city. And so I participated in both of these studies. I saw the sort of urban route. It was very loud, stressful, hot, all the things a city can be. And the forest really was lovely. So it kind of makes sense that people felt a lift in their moods. But it's interesting to me too that it was also illustrated in these physiological measures. So South Korea has taken a cue from Japan, and they actually have now about a dozen of what they're calling healing forests. And the forest agencies in both Korea and Japan have taken on human wellness as a major goal in their forest plans. So it's no longer just about timber. It's not just about recreation. It's actually specifically about wellness. And what they're going for specifically is about reducing stress, because the office worker populations in South Korea and in Japan are super intense. I mean, very longest office working hours, in the Western world, or in the world, anywhere. People literally falling dead at work. There's a name for this in Japanese. It's karoshi. Very, very high stress levels. So this is actually stumbled onto this forest in South Korea. It's a group of firefighters with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress. And they're spending 3 days in the woods. And they are engaging in activities that you don't expect to see men in the woods engaging in the United States. I'm in Montana. I would see groups of men with their rifles and their Jim Beam and their fishing rods. Here, these men are doing partner yoga. They were making floral collages. Again, participating in these tea ceremonies, meditating. And I talked to some of them, and I said, well, how do you like this? Is this doing it for you? And they said, oh my God, we wish we could live here. We don't ever want to leave. And again, these programs are being studied. Some of the psychological tests that the subjects are given are they're qualitative, and they're really about their mood or their levels of frustration or anger. And here you see a decrease of 75% in frustration in forest walkers compared to city walkers. This is a digital detox program for adolescent boys in South Korea. This one's in Seoul, in a city park in Seoul. It's led by a forest ranger or park ranger. And you see her sitting down with a group of women. And that's because if you're the mother of a digital addict, you also need some time to unwind and de-stress. So she does programs for the boys, but at the same time, she does some programs for the moms while the boys are sort of working on an exercise. And here they're making sort of a leaf pattern. They're working on leaf art. And the picture on the right, the forest ranger is leading the group of boys on quite a steep cliff. And there's a river flowing beneath him. And she said, look, if we are trying to compete with video games, we have to provide excitement and we have to provide a level of risk. And she said that is how we can compete and how we can engage all their senses. And their senses are very, very stunted in a way. I mean, these are kids who don't get outside. They go to school all day, and then they go to Hagwon all evening, where they're another school where they're learning English. They don't get outside. When they have free time, it's largely playing video games, often. I also had the good fortune of visiting some forest kindergartens. And I got very passionate about this idea of how to get kids to spend more time in nature, because this is where children's brains are supposed to develop. We are now facing the first generations really, of kids who are not learning in nature. Again, the first time in the history of our species that's happened. So when you get these kids outside in nature, they, if they're young enough, they are comfortable right away. They, again, are fully engaged. They're having a great time. And I love this picture on the right. It's a little girl. She's wearing her pajamas, because why not? She's at her forest kindergarten. She's about 5 or 6 years old. And she's climbing quite a high limb. And people are watching her, but no one is telling her to stop or to be careful or to get down. And I love this because you see the little girl in the corner of the picture, and she's looking up at that big girl and saying, ooh, I can't wait till I can climb that limb. So this is where these kids can really learn about their physical limitations. They can develop their gross motor skills, which I've heard from pediatricians these days are vastly underdeveloped compared to kids of a couple generations ago. Kids today aren't jumping. They're not walking on uneven surfaces. They're not swinging from things very often. And when you're in nature, there's no sort of programmatic play. There's no this is the monkey bar that you do this on, or this is the slide that you do this on. You have to make up your own games. And it turns out that is a tremendous advantage for kids who are learning about social and emotional development, emotional regulation, teamwork, leadership skills, self-confidence. These are all measures that have been shown to be superior in kids who go to these schools. Now, this is in Scotland and Western Europe, similar program. The kids can go here through first grade. So they're not learning a ton of academic skills through first grade. And when they get to their conventional elementary schools, they are behind their peers academically, but they catch up by third grade. And in fact, they are far ahead of their peers in many of these other measures I mentioned in terms of emotional regulation, working with others, et cetera. And those, they remain superior in those skills. Now, in this other picture, this is actually a very urban preschool with these two little boys in the red shirts. It's in downtown Edinburgh, but it has a beautiful courtyard, a nature courtyard, where these kids spend almost the whole day. And there are lots of really just, again, unstructured activities. So this little kid is like 2.5-year-old, is dragging around a branch that's probably bigger than he is. It's really pointy. And again, there's no one telling him, put down the big stick. He's just allowed to swing it around. And what the heads of these schools tell me is that, yes, this is unlike what you are comfortable seeing in the United States. She said, well, we don't believe in risk management here. We believe in hazard assessment. And so we assess whether we think something is reasonably safe. And if we think it is, we let these kids kind of go for it. And as a result, these kids really are not bored. I mean, they're really having a great time. And by the way, the weather is not always nice in Scotland and in Western Europe. So they have a saying, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And these kids are super bundled up. So they're wearing their wellies, their Wellingtons, their rubber boots, their snowsuits all the time. Oh, and just one more thing I'll tell you about the schools. I went to Finland, and Finland has among the highest test scores in the world. It's always in the top, sort of 3 or 5. And people always talk about, well, why? What's so great about the Finland schools? And you hear answers like, well, the teachers are really highly paid. They're really, really well respected. The kids are polite. What you don't hear is that those kids in elementary schools in Finland have 15 minutes of recess for every 45 minutes of instruction. So they sit for 45 minutes and then they're forced outdoors. They put on their rubber boots. They run around for 15 minutes. And I said to the teacher, well, that's a lot of instruction time that's lost. And she said, oh, no. She said, if we didn't do that, they wouldn't be able to sit still and they wouldn't pay attention. So this is trial and error that they've learned. And it really struck a chord. It's like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. This is a neat program in Scotland. It's a mental health program called Branching Out. It's a 12-week program where they take people who've recently been institutionalized, so severely mentally depressed, former institutionalized patients. They go out in the woods. They do a lot of forest sort of craft, forest art, some survival skills, some hiking skills. They're groups of people, and they have seen amazing results, partly because when you're outside, you are fostering a kind of social engagement that we know is really important for people to function in society, right? And it's also important for just emotional well-being. This has been very well proven. People who've been institutionalized are often very isolated. They're very lonely. They haven't been socializing. And being outside, kind of sharing an experience, allows them to socialize in a very kind of uncontrived way. And they think that this is one of the reasons why this program has been so successful. This is a horticultural therapy program, kind of a similar idea. This is in Denmark. It's called Acadia, another 12-week program for people who are unable to work due to what they call worker burnout. We don't really use that term, worker burnout, but I think we can all relate to what it is and what it means. And these are people who really are unable to go to work. And so they go through these 12-week programs in these gardens. When the weather's bad, they're in a greenhouse. Every time I look at this hammock, I just want to jump in it and be in it for 12 weeks myself. Sometimes, what the therapist told me there is sometimes these patients arrive and they're really cut off from their senses. They can't they don't really feel their bodies. They're not able to kind of interact with their senses, and they're allowed to proceed at their own pace in these gardens. So some of them get there and they just lie in the hammock, for the first few weeks, or they'll bundle up in a snowsuit or a sleeping bag, and they'll just sit. And eventually they'll start to sort of hear the birds, and they'll start to feel the breeze. And eventually they may start planting some things and making tea from some of the vegetation, from some of the plants. They may start working towards more advanced kind of interventions where they're trying to describe themselves metaphorically through some plants. They're saying, that the therapists have just these really interesting ways of engaging them and sort of reawakening them through this 12-week program. And it has a much more successful outcomes than any other interventions that these countries are doing. And Sweden and Denmark especially, they've been recording the outcomes. And so there's a very long waiting list to get in. The country is paying for this therapy. They're starting more programs like it. I wanted to talk about what we know about green space in general, because the idea here is to talk about nearby nature. And we don't even know sometimes if someone lives near a park, if they're using it or how they're using it. But epidemiologists are very interested in studying the differences in health between people who live close to green space and people who don't. And especially in Europe, but starting now in the United States, there are some fascinating studies coming out of this. A Dutch study of 400,000 people. So they have very good health records in a lot of these countries. In Holland, public health records. They overlay those records on maps of where people live, use satellite data to figure out how close they are to green space. And then they'll rank them in categories. Do they live closest to green space, the top quintile? Do they live not so close to green space, or do they live very far from green space? And they'll compare the health outcomes adjusted for income. So it's not just like rich, healthy people living near the parks. This is adjusted for income. And what they're seeing in people who live closest to nature is actually a lower incidence of 15 stress-related diseases. So everything from migraine to depression to anxiety, certain cardiovascular diseases, stroke. This is a UK study of 10,000 people, lower mortality rates overall, and especially for people of the lowest income. So the people who are most helped by living near green space, regardless of what we know about how they're using it, are people from the lowest incomes who seem to get the biggest health boosts. A couple of Spanish studies have found higher gestational birth weights in people who live closest to green space. There's another study in here I didn't mention, but also showing reduction of symptoms of attentional deficit disorder. So Harvard, this is a brand new data that just came out last year from the Harvard Nurses Health Initiative, which is one of the largest epidemiological studies going on in the United States. They, again, ranked people by how close they are to green space. The ones who live the closest, 13% drop in depression, and a 13% drop in overall mortality. And by the way, there's also some very weird drops that were unexpected in certain cancers. So a 40% drop in liver cancer. They don't know why, but interesting. And they're going to keep sort of drilling down to figure out why. They think that what's happening in this population that seems to be the most helped is that it seems to be working through a pathway of lowering depression. If you can lower depression, you can affect many, many other health outcomes that are stress-related. So that's one outcome. I'm really interested in this mechanism of awe because I don't think it's been talked about much. And for those of us who are interested in the benefits of nearby nature and of urban parks, it's so interesting to me to see the science emerging in the study of awe. So what is the definition of awe? Technically, it's an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli that transcend current frames of reference. So it's basically something that kind of blows your mind. And the new science of awe is showing some very interesting results. One of the ways people are studying it, researchers, is that they'll just show slides two subjects of very beautiful nature, for example, waterfalls or whales jumping, and then they'll show other subjects pictures of a suburban highway. And then they'll test them. So what the researchers are seeing is that even after looking at the beautiful slides for only 2 minutes per slide, people are reporting that they have higher aspirations that are internal. For example, I wish to make the world a better place. I wish to be helpful to my community. As compared to the subjects who look at the pictures of the more urban or less beautiful nature, they report higher rankings on, I want to make more money. I want to be successful in my career. So that's one index that they're looking at. They're also looking at actual acts of generosity. So the subjects will play computer games that are sort of standard in psychology. For example, they're given lottery tickets. And they can keep those lottery tickets or they can give them away depending on what kind of game they're playing. And they see in the nature viewers, the subjects give away more lottery tickets. They also folded more paper cranes to give to earthquake victims in Japan after the tsunami compared to people who didn't look at beautiful pictures of nature. So that's consistent with some other studies we're seeing. See, I'm just going to get there. Okay. So this is one of my favorite awe studies. This is a little pocket of very tall eucalyptus trees on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. So it's not a kind of wilderness area, but it is an impressive stand of trees. And psychologist Dr. Keltner at Berkeley sent a group of students to gaze up at these majestic trees for 1 minute. And he sent another group of students to gaze up at a tall building on campus, again, for 1 minute. In each scenario, the research technician accidentally dropped a box of pens and surreptitiously recorded how many pens the subjects helped pick up. And in the tree viewers, those subjects picked up statistically more pens than the ones who looked at the buildings. So what is it about awe? Well, Einstein said the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. Awe gives us perspective, right? It takes us out of our own heads, and it makes us feel part of a larger world. As Emerson famously said, it dissolves ego. He said, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and lifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. Another thing I like to say about awe is that it likes to be shared. When people experience awe together, it brings them closer together. But we have to figure out what it actually looks like in the brain. Are there biomarkers for these kinds of changes that we see? Now, this is not a real experiment. This was a photo that was staged for National Geographic, but it's people wearing these portable EEG caps. But there are real studies, and there are real studies looking at what people can see or what's happening in their brains. And one study I like was at Stanford. And it, again, divided these subjects into two, sent some of them out to walk around El Camino Real, which is a busy street in downtown Palo Alto, sent another group to walk along the Stanford Dish, which is the open space outside of Palo Alto. Again, not a spectacular wilderness area, but a pretty green space. And actually then the groups switched. So some of them went first to the green space, some of them went first to the city, then they swapped. Their brains were measured before and after. They were scanned, actually. And some interesting things showed up. Specifically in a part of the prefrontal cortex called the subgenual prefrontal cortex. And researcher, psychologist Greg Bratman believes that this is kind of the seat of rumination in our brains. So rumination is, the definition of that is sort of where we replay negative thinking. And I think we've all experienced that. We have a negative interaction with someone at work, or there's something going on at home, and we replay it over and over, and we kind of just can't seem to get rid of it very easily. It's very much associated with depression, ruminative thinking. And he saw that in the urban walkers, that part of the brain remained active both before and after the walk. But in the nature walkers, that part of the brain really shrunk down. It really deactivated. Here's a picture, by the way, of the two different environments where people walked. This is Dr. David Strayer, and he also wants to know what happens. That walk was just a 90-minute walk, but he's curious, what happens after 2 or 3 days in the wilderness? What can you see in the brain then? And are there effects? So he's also studying the part of the frontal cortex. He is interested in these brain waves called midline frontal theta. This part of the brain is very active when we are multitasking or trying to multitask, when we are working our executive function, which we all do all day long in our office jobs. We're responding to email, we're responding to texts on our phone, we're planning the day, we are checking off our to-do list, and we're not getting much of a break in there. I think we all know that feeling of just information coming at us 100 miles a minute. So he designed an experiment. Again, this isn't part of the wilderness experiment. This is just in a local arboretum in downtown Salt Lake City. He sent groups of students to walk through this for just 30 minutes. One group he had call their mothers or call someone else, use their phones. And another group put their phones down and really be in the environment and just walk around. He didn't tell them what he was going to be measuring, but when they came back, he gave them a test to see how much they recalled of this beautiful arboretum. And what he saw was that in the people who were on the phone, that part of their brain, that midline frontal theta, was super activated. And in the people who were not on the phone, it was actually deactivated. And those people, the people who were on the phone, performed as badly on that recall test as people who never took the walk at all. So when people ask me, well, is it okay if I'm on the phone or if I have my earbuds in while I go for my walk? I look at this study and I say, well, it may be somewhat beneficial, but if you really want to bang for your buck, you need to figure out how to take the phone off, turn it off. This is me wearing one of the EEG helmets, and so this was after 3 days in the wilderness, and my data did correspond with that deactivation in the frontal cortex. This is on the San Juan River, which is a river that I ran with my dad when I was a teenager, and it was fun to be back there. And so the idea is that sometimes we do need wilderness, that in wilderness is where we can recover from certain life events like trauma or grief. It's where we can think about our place in the world and who we are and who we want to be. That's why we see many cultures around the world really emphasize wilderness in rites of passage. It's a very important time for rituals in many cultures, something we've really lost in our culture. So, I think that people intuitively know that going outside is good for their mental health. This is from a very recent study that just came out. Asked adults how important is getting into nature for your emotional health. And look at this. 74% of people responded very or extremely. We saw a similar result for parents reporting whether nature contact was good for their children. This is across, by the way, many races, many different ethnic groups, many social strata, and the results were quite consistent across different races. Although especially, I will say, for the Hispanic numbers showed them to be the most nature connected of anyone, which I think is interesting. But again, very high percentage showed, over 90% said my children are happier when they've had nature contact. 89% said healthier. 79% self-confident. So I think these numbers are really remarkable, but we have to acknowledge that what people believe to be true and what they actually act upon are very different. And there's a gulf between intention and actuality. There are many barriers to people spending time outside. Some of it has to do with the quality of the parks nearby, the quality of the nature, Is there nature nearby? Can they get to it? And part of it just has to do with sort of the demands of indoor life. I mean, kids today are really overprogrammed. And of course, we all live in cities. Most of us, 80% of the United States is urban. 50% of the globe is urban. And that's a figure that just shifted from now more than half of the globe lives in urban areas. This just happened in 2008, so it's very recent. There's one anthropologist is suggesting that we call ourselves metro sapiens. We're really in a new habitat that we have not ever been in these kinds of numbers before. Here's Washington, D.C. This shows a change in tree cover in 16 years, or well, let's see, no, it's more than 16 years, 24 years, between 1973 and 1997. And we know that areas with over 50% tree canopy decreased from 34% to 13% in the city, while areas with only 20% tree canopy have increased from 51% to 71%. So more areas, fewer trees. And the tree canopy over this time period resulted in a 34% increase in stormwater runoff. The losses in ecosystem services provided by the trees, such as cleaning the air and water, were estimated at $1.2 million a year in those losses. Now, since this picture in 1997 was taken, actually more trees have been planted. I haven't seen more recent figures, although if any of you have them, I'd like to see them. But the DC has initiated a tree planting campaign. We are seeing more of it, so I'd be curious to know how much it's come back. So I'm really interested in this idea of the nature pyramid, and it's something I wanted to share with you because at the very tippy top is this idea that we do need these kind of rarer, more rarefied excursions into wilderness areas, and we may only get that once a year. We may only get it once every 5 years. Some people maybe only get it a couple of times in a lifetime. But look at this. In the middle and the bottom, this is really where our parks come in. This is nearby nature at the bottom. This is really our bread and butter. These are our backyards, our pocket parks, the trees on our streets that we know are associated with positive health benefits. And in the middle, you have kind of the meat of your nature exposure or your nature allotment. And this is really where we have these more intentional visits to our local parks, our regional parks, and our state parks. The benefits to being there are even more profound. So nature exists on kind of a dose curve. If you think about nature as being a medical intervention, that nearby nature is very beneficial in terms of relieving stress and giving us a cognitive boost. But once you get into the middle of that pyramid, that's where you really start to see changes in people's levels of depression. In fact, the researchers in Finland are recommending that's a country where there's a lot of depression, a lot of obesity, a lot of the things we're seeing in this country. They're recommending a minimum dose of 5 hours a month of time in parks, forests and parks. And so that sort of ends up being about 30 to 40 minutes twice a week. And they're seeing if people can get that as a minimum baseline, they can actually prevent depression. So how do we get more nearby nature? To find out, I went to Singapore because this is the future. Singapore is the third densest city on the planet. And I told you the DC tree cover has basically changed from 50% to 35%. Singapore in that same time period has done the opposite. Despite having huge increases in population, the green space in Singapore has changed from 35% to 50%. And they've done it because they had very, very dedicated policies, encouraging developers to more than replace the green space that they used up. So they did that by putting gardens and green space on parking lots, on rooftops, and this is so interesting to me, on the vertical sides of these office buildings and buildings. So you see these buildings that sort of, this was my hotel in Singapore, and it looked like a chia plant. It was growing grass out of every side. In fact, when my cab driver dropped me off here, he said, "Oh, you're so lucky. You get to wake up in the morning and you can just go browsing." But it's not just the fancy office buildings and the nice hotels. It's also worker housing. There's a ton of worker housing, like 80% of Singapore lives in sort of subsidized worker housing. Lots of green corridors that are being developed, trails, bike paths. This used to be an underground canal, and it's been unzipped and daylighted with new plantings, new vegetation. The birds are coming in, the fish are coming in, and people are using them. And this is a hospital, again, not in the fancy part of town. It's called Khoo Teck Puat Hospital. I was floored by this place. It had gardens and plants and vegetation everywhere. There were vegetables that the patients could grow on the roof. There were places where visiting family members could reflect. There were places for the staff to unwind. We know that hospital staff make many mistakes. It's one of the largest causes of death in hospitals, or accidents. Fewer mistakes get made when the nursing staff and the medical staff can have a place to recover from their stresses of their day. The biophilia concept, this love of nature, is even in the walls and the design of the decor. And they've really embraced this idea of providing habitat for endangered species. Singapore is trying to increase their biodiversity index, in addition to providing green space that has this kind of also scientific index that they're measuring. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that nature doesn't have to be, and awe doesn't have to be spectacular. It can be wildlife. It can be urban wildlife. This is actually in the tidal pools in Seattle. This is the Tacoma Nature Center. Many, many groups of kids go walking these tidal basins. They see things like this sea star. Cities around the world are figuring out how to create spaces of awe. This is actually a snorkel trail in the middle of downtown Wellington. So you can like walk out of Wellington with your snorkel and go see some pretty cool things. We're seeing some urban hospitals starting to embrace the idea of parks prescriptions. And there's some of that going on here at Unity Health Center. Robert Czar is creating an app on his phone so that he can provide patients with mapping data, GPS data, of where their nearest parks are so that their families can go use them. And he's prescribing kids. He's actually changing the way they walk to school. He's telling their families that these are the parks they can access really easily on the weekends. It's good for the whole family, not just the kids. This is outside of LA. And this is a nice quote that I got from Dr. Nushin Rozani, who understands that access is a problem. So she's actually partnered with local parks to provide busing services so that kids can get out of Oakland, get to these regional parks outside the city. She said, yes, we're seeing a lot more physical activity and play in children, but the magical part of it is that the parents get to relax and sit together and talk. The word for it is joy, gratitude and joy. And then, of course, I had to sneak this in. This is at Brookside Gardens. This is my daughter. And she said this is she told me the name of it, is it like a red-eared turtle? Red-eared slider. Is that right? Red-eared slider? Okay, cool. So she knows that she was probably 9 years old in this picture. And that was her moment of awe right there. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions if you have any. I think we have a microphone that we'll need to scoot around.
Now we can really hear you. One of the things I thought was very interesting about your book was that it talked about creativity and how that was boosted from these experiences. And I was telling my mother, because she wants to be a creative writer even more than I was like, well, we got to get out and walk around. Do you have any more data behind that? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, there's not a ton of data in the field of creativity. There's more sort of in these other physiological responses. It's a little tricky to measure creativity, but psychologists and neuroscientists do have ways of doing that. That guy David Strayer I showed you in Utah, he published a study in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences where he gave people a word test before and after a 3-day backpacking trip. And he saw an increase of 50% in their scores. And this is considered a measure, these word tests were considered a measure of convergent creativity, where there's sort of one answer to a sort of tricky word test, and he'd give them a series. And 50% increase, which is pretty huge. And that study was actually replicated in the Boundary Waters canoe area with a group that went out for, I think, 6 days. Again, a 50% increase in that measure of creativity. Greg Bratman, who did that study at Stanford around the Stanford dish, also did some studies where he saw increases in attention span and short-term memory. And there have been other studies like that in Michigan. So also some studies with kids who have ADHD showing tremendous drop in symptoms and greater attention in those kids after just 20 minutes of being playing around a park, running around a park. There are also some really interesting studies looking at school grounds showing that test scores go up, attention spans go up, even in school classrooms that face greenery out the window, as opposed to the parts of the school that look out onto a brick wall. So I think there's a lot of intriguing data starting to be developed here. I think more needs to be done.
You spoke about the experience of awe and people like to share more.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that. What does that say, or even is there studies that speak to the issue of, like, in urban settings, of having the landscape, of having parks, and how that plays into, community, or a greater
Yes.
sense of community, of sharing, of more interaction
Yes.
within that type of context?
Yes. There are some studies looking at that. The woman, Frances Kuo, who did the study, the ADHD study I just mentioned, she and her colleague, Bill Sullivan, did a number of studies looking at housing projects in Chicago. Really fascinating studies showing that some of the housing projects there have very barren courtyards, very barren surroundings, and some of them have quite nice grasses and trees. People get randomly assigned to those units. And in studies, they showed that in the greener areas, there was less crime. There was also less sort of self-reported feelings of aggression, less violence. And in teenagers who were studied, whose windows faced those views as opposed to the barren views, in girls, interestingly, but not in boys, the girls showed much higher measures of self-regulation and less impulsiveness. And less measures of aggression. And they think it was because of the girls and not the boys, because the girls are the ones who are actually kept inside more. It wasn't safe enough for the girls to go wandering around. So where they were mattered. Their environment mattered. So, again, intriguing studies. There's also a study in Philadelphia, inner city Philadelphia, showing, I think, a drop in gun violence once these neighborhood sort of brown spaces are turned into green spaces and turned into gardens.
This kind of follows on that last question. I'm interested in the design of parks. If I understood your pyramid a few slides back, it looked like the wilder the area was, the greater effect it had, greater positive effect it had on individual psychology. Can you apply, if that is in fact true, can you apply that to how we should design urban parks?
So I'm not convinced the science on that is really in yet. In the Finland study I mentioned, they looked at sort of 3 levels of greenness. And, well, one was really an urban center, one was a sort of manicured park, and one was a wilder wooded area. And there was a curve. So there were benefits to the manicured park. They saw more benefits to the wild spaces, but still a lot of benefits to the urban parks. So there have been other studies looking at biodiversity. You know, do people feel better if they're surrounded by greater numbers of species? And that data is kind of all over the place. It's not really clear. You know, in Singapore, certainly a lot of the parks in Singapore are not spectacularly diverse. You know, there's not a ton of tree diversity, although they're working on that with this biodiversity index. But you still see people flocking to these green spaces, really enjoying them. So I think it's hard to know. I think that there are still, you know, we still can point to lots of benefits in these kind of more conventional manicured places.
In thinking of access in urban spaces, is there any data on the minimum size of a green space? You know, we have pocket parks or one vacant lot or a small community garden, or even distance, that it has to be within so many blocks or quarter mile or something like that?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think the science here is so new that we haven't really drilled down to know sort of what are the elements of nature. How big does it have to be? Who are the people most helped? Which are the, you know, outcomes that are most likely to happen? I think there's a lot that still needs to happen there. It looks like there are some benefits. If there's a benefit to having a potted plant in your office, and there are studies that show that, then, you know, I'm sure the pocket park is doing something. But hard to figure out how big does it really have to be to get the biggest bang. I don't know.
Could you hold your question?
Hang on.
We're recording, so if you could speak into the microphone.
Thank you.
Were there any studies done in Holland where they are known to have very few sunny days per year, and how weather would affect the time that you're actually able to spend out in nature?
People have asked me that about Finland too. I mean, a lot of these countries that are the most nature-connected countries are very dark, you know, for half the year, and they're very light for half the year. One thing that really struck me about the Finnish people is how they go out, even in the black of day. You know, they will go cross-country skiing at night, you know, basically at night. And there are some lights sometimes strung up along these cross-country ski courses. We know that there are still a lot of benefits that people get from smelling, you know, the evergreens, from you know, again, like feeling the snow under their feet. So I think the light piece is one of many things, but it's only one. You know, the visuals are just one piece of it. So I think there's still, and of course there are some really interesting studies looking at the night sky, right, which is one of the most awesome kind of, you know, experiences we have viewing the night sky. I was with a group of Girl Scouts in Colorado a few months ago, and it was December. We went for a night hike. It was, I think, 9 degrees out. These were middle school girls, and if any of you have ever worked with middle school girls, it's not often that they are so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. When these girls were looking up at the night sky, that's how quiet it was. And some of them said, you know, I have never seen the Milky Way before. I have never seen a shooting star before. Because they live in Denver, where there is no Milky Way. You cannot see it.
Hi. I think a lot of the things you said are remarkable, and we as citizens are aware of the value of the environment and Mother Nature. And I think some of the people here work in the government. It seems to me there's sort of a dilemma or dichotomy between the awareness of the value of nature, as you have so eloquently defined it, and public policy for growth, for development, for removal of property, for economic base. And I know you can't answer that, but it's a real dilemma, I think, in this county and perhaps in the United States. So I'm hoping, eventually public policy hopefully can catch up. And it's an observation that my own community is struggling with. And it's a real fact. So it's unfortunate, but it is something we have to grapple with. How do you reconcile the resource allocation? Thank you.
I think that's one of the reasons why I'm excited about this book project and the research going on in this area, is that we are seeing more evidence, because we are an evidence-based society. And if we can really show that people are more productive, that they are sick less often, that they miss fewer days of work, that they are performing better in school, if you can show those kinds of outcomes as really being associated with green space and access to green space, then you have a much stronger argument, I think, for why it's important, not only to individuals, but to a functioning community. It's Frederick Law Olmsted who said, we need nature for civilization. It makes us nicer people, and it makes us better people. It makes us more functional people. Nature, to him, was critical for democracy, which I think is a really interesting idea that we've kind of lost sight of.
One more question.
Okay, one more question.
Just building on the question of public policy, do you have case studies where the city or the government find ways to encourage developers to actually donate more? You mentioned Singapore.
Yeah.
So can you talk about a couple of case studies that we might be able to learn from?
Yes. Well, in Scotland, the research there is so clear, too. And again, especially in Glasgow, there's a tremendous amount of poverty, of drug addiction, suicide. Public policy is shifting now to a point where the government in Scotland is saying, this is our new policy, that everyone in the country deserves to live within 400 meters of a woodland. So that's about a quarter of a mile, I think. It's a policy goal that everyone should live within 400 meters, a quarter of a mile of a woodland. And so to make that happen, it is a very forested country. They don't necessarily have to plant new forests, but they are encouraging developers not to tear down the woodlands that are there. And then they're making the woodlands more comfortable. So, for example, creating pathways where people feel safe, creating programs where schools can use these parks and woodlands during the day so that other people in the neighborhood feel more comfortable going into them, policing them to keep out drug dealing, for example, creating walking groups so that people feel more secure going into these spaces. So there are lots of public policies that can happen from sort of a health standpoint, but also I think from a public planning and urban planning standpoint, in terms of just making them more usable and sort of airing them out a little so that they're more comfortable. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.